Yeah.
Okay, hi, Professor. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today on Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. If you could just introduce yourself, your field of study, your expertise, and the university that you come from, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much for having me on this snowy Sunday morning, cold DC. I am Kwame Edwin Otu. I am a cultural anthropologist currently at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Services, where my intellectual home is located. I do a host of projects. I mean, my intellectual breadth is quite expansive. I find everything interesting, right? So I don't limit myself. I don't really discipline myself, like by saying I say I'm a cultural anthropologist because that is what makes me comprehensible. And so I have done work on LGBT human rights, which is what my first book is on. I think that in many ways the locus of my interest is citizenship and citizenship formation, ideas of belonging and unbelonging, freedom and unfreedom. They really all animate my work. And I come to these topics because of my own identity as a queer Guinean man, right? That I really try not to dissociate my identity and subjectivity from my work. My ongoing project now in Ghana is on electronic waste deposition. I am conducting this ethnography amongst a community of e-waste workers. I'm really interested in how they navigate the deposition of e-waste in Ghana. Ghana allegedly has the world's largest electronic waste dump. So I'm interested in the ways in which these men's relationship to electronic waste can really tell us about what waste means to the human body, what humans get to work with waste, and why particular humans, particular Ghanaians or particular citizens, right, are designated as those who work with waste, right? So I come to this project because of my understanding that waste is itself a kind of queer material, queer object, because waste is not gendered. Waste is not classed. Everybody produces waste. So when you go to the waste dump really somehow gives you a reflection or gaze into it's an archive of everyday life, really. And so that's really about what I do. And I used to teach at the University of Virginia. I've been at Georgetown for now, this is my second year, but I taught at UVA for almost 7.5 years. So I'm happy to be here and I'm really looking forward to chin wagging with you on Cesaire, who happens to be one of my favorite thinkers for many reasons. I can't list all of them here, but yeah, I'm excited to really be challenged and to also challenge on this topic and subject.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation. And could you kind of tell us a little bit about your relationship to Césaire and what role perhaps that discourse on colonialism has played in your intellectual development? Maybe the first time that you read it, your initial thoughts?
So, good question. I think that, for someone who went to school in Ghana,
Mhm.
the University of Ghana was where I got my bachelor's. You would think that, of course, it's Africa that you get exposed to Césaire, right? But I really became an anti-colonial thinker, or I began to really seriously engage with these anti-colonial thinkers. I mean, of course, Césaire being one of them when I moved to the US, right? They hadn't Césaire, Fanon, I mean, they had never been on my intellectual radar, right? And so I came here for my master's at Ohio University. That is when I began to encounter Fanon a bit. And when I went to Syracuse for my PhD, I was so lucky to take a course of this African feminist, or she describes herself as a feminist from Africa because she doesn't want to be branded a nationalist, right? So she's like, I'm a feminist from Africa. So Patricia McFadden is her name. She taught this class called Revolutionary Struggles, and the class really came with this smorgasbord of intellectuals, from Said to Cabral. Césaire was one of the thinkers we were introduced to. And I had never read Discourse. And we read Discourse on colonialism, and my eyes just like it popped out. I'm like, what? and just really thinking about, the ideological harm, right, of coloniality on colonized bodies, right? And really, I think that is what, for me, discourse exposed me to. I mean, it's discourse, so discourse is, ideological, right? And so the context in which I was exposed to discourse on colonialism was in this class that really assembled a host of intellectuals, African and African diasporic radical intellectuals who have actually been trying to also unsettle or reckon with the kinds of questions, you are contending with, I am contending with, and in many ways showing me that, well, I'm not asking any new questions, that these questions have already been asked. Maybe I might have a different answer to the questions that are asked. And I think that is one of the things that discourse did for me, really, that it was really, giving me a way to ask questions, because sometimes we ask the wrong questions. And I think discourse did that for me. So, I mean, the context for me was Patricia McFadden's revolutionary struggles, which I taught here, and I taught you. So, yeah, that is really, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
And for the kind of temporal context, could you kind of contextualize discourse for us, kind of answer the question as to what the piece says about the time that it was written socially, culturally, in terms of race, in terms of class?
Mhm. I mean, temporality, I mean, I wonder, quite frankly, what Caesar would say if he were alive today, like given the very convoluted situation in which we are with the war in Gaza, with the expropriatory projects happening in the Congo,
Mm,
with the Sudan wars, and again the histories behind these destructive projects, right? So I think the context in which Cesaire is writing obviously is anticipated by the end of slavery, and also the beginnings of the post-independence era, right? And so the 40s and the 50s are actually clearly the terrain in which discourse is being brewed, right? And Cesaire himself is contending with this kind of, francophone colonial environment, which somehow purports itself to be this very liberal, right? Very democratic, very egalite, this,
minute.
very equalitarian, if you will. And so I think discourse is somehow an excavate. I mean, when I read discourse, like I think Césaire is finishing us with a kind of it's an excavation of the fictions, right, of Western liberalism, right, and basically trying to demonstrate, just, I mean, how can this be civilized? How can we call this project a civilized project when it is really based on the violence of the violence wrought on colonial subjects? Um, because again, this is a time when there are all these independence movements unfolding, right? People are fighting for their independence, like, in Ghana, in India, in, the Caribbean, like there's really this ferment, brewing all over the place. And this ferment for freedom, this ferment for emancipation is being it's being sabotaged, right? So then Césaire is bearing witness to this and is saying that, well, if you claim to be the arbiter of freedom and of democracy, why are you suppressing these movements for freedom?
Mhm.
Right. And I think it becomes a kind of manifesto, right, that somehow um, you know, encourages or enables for those who are fighting for this independence to also understand that, you are not just fighting for political independence, the independence you're fighting for is also discursive,
Right.
right? It's also mental, it's intellectual, right? It's not just the material. And I think that's what makes Césaire very distinguishable from the Marxist anti-colonialist. This is basically trying to say that this is really deeply embedded in our consciousness, right? And how can we free ourselves from this colonial consciousness that continues to be in the way or inhibits us from seeing, right, the fictions and the falsities and the lie, right, that we've been sold and told by our colonial masters.
Right. And on the kind of connection between the Marxist thought on coloniality and Césaire's kind of really independent thought on the colonial issue, he writes in Discourse that Europe has been shaped by centuries of bourgeois rule, and that situation has given rise to what he sees as two main problems and two main contradictions, being the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. And I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit about what the connection is between what he calls the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem, and if they are interlinked, if they are entirely separate, which one takes precedence in terms of importance.
So I think they are interlinked in many ways because, bourgeois rule actually is based on the proletariat problem, right? And, when you think of the emergence of capitalism, right, that capitalism really coincides with colonialism, right? Like, I think that you can't talk about the colonial project without really thinking about the bourgeois emergence, right? And of course, when Marx talks about the transitions that society has gone through from the feudal to the bourgeois overlords really come to replace the feudal lords, right? So I think that we need to temporarily locate the emergence of bourgeois rule, right, with the emergence of, bourgeois may as well be colonial, right? The proletariat may as well be the colonized, right? Except that what we see, I think colonialism really somehow makes the capitalism of Europe, right, macro. Right. And so then to talk about the global proletariat, right, is really talking about the colonized, right, that they are the global proletariat. And so this distinction is important because I think by having this understanding that, like, in Europe, where we had the European proletariat, which is where Marx is getting his, Marxist his theory, right? Because Marx really doesn't reflect on the global proletariat. He doesn't really engage with the proletariat and on the colonies, right? Because he's really focused on the Industrial Revolution and what it is happening in what it is doing in Europe. He's forgetting the other Industrial Revolution, right? The other Industrial Revolution, which is populated or animated by enslaved people in the Americas and colonized subjects in Africa and Asia and Latin America, right? That there's something very interesting about Marx making that omission, but I feel these are interlinked, that the proletariat problem, is really anticipatory of what becomes the global proletariat problem, which is connected to colonization. So when I think of colonialism, I think of colonialism as or imperialism, if you will, as really the first and highest stage of capitalism.
As Lenin
does. Yeah.
As well, in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And to return to that question kind of civilization and the connection between, the civilizing mission and colonization, Cesaire writes that between colonization and civilization, there is an infinite distance. And I wanted to kind of pose the question to you, in your view, what is the relationship between colonization and civilization?
I think when Césaire talks about that, it's Césaire's way of trying to problematize what is civilization and what is colonization, because colonization is clearly what civilization is not. Colonization is primarily, when looked at closely, an uncivilized problem, right? Civilizations in the context in which Césaire is trying to compel us to reframe this concept or project shouldn't have any connection to colonization. So that's what explains the infinite distance.
Mhm.
Right, that they shouldn't be the same, right? Because the colonial project really then marks and undermines or like really blackens or it leaves this crater in what Europe is calling civilization.
Right.
How can you be colonized? How can you be colonizing and be civilized at the same time? It doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Because civilized people don't do the kind of things, the colonial apparatus or the colonial architecture, wrought.
Mhm.
That is not what civilization does. So I think in doing so too, what Césaire is basically trying to say is that there's a certain paradox in this Eurocentric conceptualization of civilization,
Mhm.
because that is not what he sees.
Right.
Césaire is not seeing civilization. Césaire is seeing the brutality of the colonial the colonizers. Césaire is seeing just how barbaric they are based on their maltreatment of the colonized subjects. That is not what civilization is. And so that infinite distance is really Césaire's way of really calling out, right, what the white people or the colonists are calling civilization what it is, that this ain't civilization. This is some barbarism. Sheikh Anta Diop, Civilization and Barbarism, right? So this is really what Sheikh Anta Diop takes up in his book, Civilization or Barbarism. I mean, this is really the title of his book.
Right. And it's kind of upon that hypothesis that Césaire builds to his thesis that Europe is indefensible. And in
Mhm.
Césaire's view, the European civilization and Western Europe in particular is in decline because of this kind of tension or maybe this cognitive dissonance that exists between the purported humanistic philosophy and the actuality of brutality in the colonies. And so I kind of wanted to ask you whether or not you think that this kind of prophecy of Césaire's that the Western civilization is in decline and how we can apply that thinking to our modern day context today, if we can still see those contradictions.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think the war in the Gaza conflict is really making this contradiction so palpable, right? And the kinds of language that have been used, the kind of vocabularies that have been used to even capture and describe, the Palestinian as a human subject, right? And so I think this idea of the human, I mean, your question is really making me take seriously, like perhaps may want to return to, because you brought up humanism, right? Like, what is a human, right? Like, what kind of human, quite frankly, Aisha, animates this project of humanism? Like, when we are somehow returning to this humanist project, or we engage in, talk that somehow amplifies humanism, like, what is a human in humanism? Is it you? Is it me? And in what ways has the discourse around humanism, fomented a certain exclusionary and inclusionary projects, right? That in many ways have brought us to where we are today, that we can't even acknowledge Palestinian lives as human lives, Black lives as human lives, right? So then Césaire is really bearing witness to what is happening on the colonies, or had long happened on the colonies, what the colonists are doing to Black people, to Indians, to people in the Caribbean, to indigenous people. And Césaire is like, oh, but when Hitler did this to the Jewish people, he did what you have long been doing to us, to the Jews. But then that somehow, is what angers you to stage what you call a world war. Why didn't you have world wars during slavery? Why didn't you? But then the world war is precisely because, your idea or your understanding of the human as a particular figure, a subject, white, of course, as a European, as a your idea of the human as a primarily white subject, right? That unity, I think what Hitler does is to really, to expose us, right? This fragility of white unity, right? Which unity was used to exploit and to control and dominate non-white people.
Right.
Right? So Cesaire is basically saying that, oh, now that Hitler has used the same weapons you've used on us, on your own people, you are beginning to question what humanity is. So I think that, like, when Cesaire is thinking of, if Cesaire had been alive right now, I think the same concerns would unfold, because, I mean, think about how Palestinians have been even described by Israelis, right? Like, it's the same discourse, right, that was used to describe Black people in the colonies. I mean, I think about the Mau Mau and the way they were vilified by the British. Now, we look back in history and we call the Mau Mau, we look back in history and we call the Mau Mau a liberatory organization. But when the Mau Mau existed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they were called terrorist organizations. They were called savages. So then in 100 or 50 years from now, how are we, for example, going to call Hamas?
Mm-hmm.
Would we say Hamas was a liberatory organization? Or are we still going to call them terrorists? So in many ways, Cesaire is basically telling us that the antecedents have been set.
Right.
Right? So whatever is happening right now is not really new. And it's not really new because we are caught within the same colonial matrix.
Right.
That has produced the very conditions in which Israel and Palestine are in right now.
And if I could just read this passage that we were talking about a few days back that really sums up what you're saying here. Cesaire writes that people say, "How strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass." And they wait and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had only been applied to non-European peoples.
Mhm.
He goes on to say that the entirety of Western Christian civilization is engulfed. He calls it engulfed in reddened waters. And I love
Mhm.
the poetic way that he speaks.
He's a poet.
Yeah. And he says that Western Christian civilization oozes, seeps, and it trickles from every crack, that the reddened waters. And I just wanted to, kind of pose the question to you on, I wanted to zoom in a little bit on, he says Western Christian civilization, in particular, kind of making a remark out of the religiosity and the way that the religiosity contributes to this kind of hypocritical policy towards non-white people in general. And I wanted you to, give us your reflections on the connection between institutionalized religion, specifically Christianity within this context, and what role it plays in upholding or perhaps um,
Mhm.
further entrenching the civilizing mission, the colonial structure.
Mhm. So, Max Weber, I'm sorry I'm bringing Weber here, will find your question very interesting because, he talks about the ways in which institutionalized religion, especially in the context of the emergence of capital. So then I'm really intrigued by the ways in which you qualify Western Christianity, Western Christianity, because we need to also think about the ways in which capital, right, somehow uses religion as a conduit to legitimize itself in ways that actually also masks, right, the violent trepidations of capital, right? So religion is a distraction, if you will. When I say like religion in many ways, so of course, when Marx says religion is the opiate of the masses, the opiate is really the distraction, So capitalism really weaponizes religion to distract us from really being able to see its virulent effects on us as a people, but Marx Weber is basically saying that no, actually, capital and the capital produces religion. The desire for capital. So when he talks about Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, right, that these are the kinds of the genetic code of capital, that the genetic code of religion, the religion, Western Christianity in particular, because this is different from Islam. This is very different from, so the genetic code of Western Christianity is capital, my love.
Right. And then,
Right. So then the institutional, so what I'm trying to say is that there is something about the ways in which Césaire is calling out Western Christianity by saying that, well, you can't call, if I'm calling capitalism out, if I'm calling colonialism out, right, the unholy, this is the unholy trinity: capitalism, colonialism, Christianity.
and what's really interesting about the Protestant aspect that you were talking about is that in Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, she talks about how the Protestant work ethic was important in creating the industrial prison system in the United States. And what you kind of just brought to light was that, yes, there is a very strong connection between that Protestant idea of work ethic and production to the production of capital. And I would even go even further and ask you, because Cesaire says in no uncertain terms that at the end of capitalism, there is Hitler. And this perhaps could be viewed as a very inflammatory statement. So I think that it would be beneficial for you if you could walk us through this: at the end of capitalism, there is Hitler. There's a world of kind of knowledge and theory that he is encompassing in this one sentence. If you could kind of explain, what do you think that he means by this, and what is the connection between capitalism and essentially Nazism, is what he's suggesting here?
Well, what he says when he says at the end of capital there's Hitler could be read in many ways, okay? I mean, I'm just going to give you my interpretation. One, my primary interpretation of this line, Aisha, is that capitalism produced Hitler, right? So at the end of capitalism, so capitalism, this infrastructure of capitalism was what gave birth to Hitler, right? And of course, we can actually glean from this, convenient metaphor, right? That Cesaire is so sharp. Cesaire is fundamentally saying that.
Speak on it.
No, to be a capitalist means you are a Nazi. Because capitalism requires the same technologies of violence that the Nazis use.
Right.
They build factories, they put humans in these factories, they gas them up. Where are they getting all the scientific knowledge? Where are they getting the architecture? I mean, think about slavery. So then there is something even about the architectural formation of the factory, the industry, that the Nazis use to detain, to imprison, to gas the gas chambers. All these infrastructures are the carbon copy of those factories of capital that we see during the Industrial Revolution. Right? And in fact, capital, in many ways, or capitalism enhances the science, right, behind the violence. that the Nazis used to exterminate the Jews. But then, of course, before that, the colonists were doing it to Black people. Americans were doing it on the plantations in the Caribbean. Those same mechanisms of violence were already at play.
Mhm. And kind of on the topic of the capitalist system and the degradation of human rights, Cesaire kind of points out that capitalist society, at least he says, at least at its present stage, is incapable of establishing a concept of the rights of all men. And I kind of wanted to ask you, do you concur with this
I
statement?
concur. I mean, of course.
Yeah, and
Because
why is that?
capitalism is based on people who have rights and people who do not have rights.
Mhm,
Capitalism is based on inequality.
mhm,
Capitalism is based on exploitation. And then in a world of exploitation, the exploited have no right, the exploiter has rights.
mhm.
So that is he's right.
Right. And do you think that, for the sake of argument, do you think that a kind of ethic of human equality could ever be achieved under a capitalist system with
Oh
the
no, no, this is not a question we even have to ask.
well, let's pose the question.
No, no, no. Capitalism is actually innately and inherently unequal, is violent and exploitative. Capitalism and its notion of right is just, a masquerade,
Mhm,
right? Capitalism believes in symbolic rights. It doesn't really believe in the right to transform capital.
mhm,
Capitalism believes in this fiction. Capitalism transforms rights. Rights do not, the rights we have now would never transform capital.
right,
Why? Because capitalism determines what is right,
right,
who is human,
mhm,
who is palatable, who is respectable, who is, fungible, who is disposable,
right,
right? And as someone who works on waste, what waste tells me about the fact that, waste work really exposes the fraudulence in this capitalist pursuit of a universal human rights. No, it's never going to happen.
And, Césaire says about pre-colonial African societies
Mhm,
that not only were they anti-capitalist as an ANTE capitalist, but they were
mhm,
also anti-capitalist as an ANTI
mhm,
capitalist.
mhm.
And I kind of wanted to, pose you the question because I always love talking about pre-colonial African societies. And I wanted to ask you, what does he mean when he says that African societies were anti-capitalist? Does he mean simply that pre-colonial African societies had more of a communalist way of living? Is he saying that these societies were organized in a way that was kind of antithetical to modern capitalism? And if so, are there any historical examples of this kinds of organization?
I mean, of course, there is that. Again, I don't want to say that, like, pre-capitalist societies did not have their own, mechanisms of control and subjugation. And I mean, I do not want to romanticize pre-capitalist societies, but the anti-capitalism he talks about, anti-capital meaning there was a form of capitalism in these societies before the arrival of European capital, right? And of course, this capitalism that existed, or what we are calling pre-capitalism, or African capitalism, had its, limitations and everything, because it was a kind of feudal capitalism, right? So in that respect, I try to be very skeptical of Césaire's kind of celebratory tone,
Mhm.
right? That, the feudal capital was also violently sexist, right? Violently like tribalistic, right? That we had indigenous slavery, like and so these kinds of things needs to make us be very interrogatory, if you will, of these pre-capitalist formations. However, there's a certain value in understanding the anti-capital nature. And when I say anti-capital now, ANTI, the anti-capitalist nature of these anti-capital ANTE societies, which is the kind of their formation or their embeddedness of these capitalist formations within communal thresholds, right? That unlike European capitalism, where there was such a celebration of the individual success and whatnot, right? That in many African contexts, right, you can see this through our kinships and clan networks, right? Land is not owned by an individual. Land is owned by the clan, land is owned by the lineage. So property is really communally owned. So these are examples, and we still have these legacies in many parts of Ghana, where I'm from, right? So those are like legitimate examples where land ownership is actually somehow within the purview of the community, of clans, of lineages, and not at the behest, if you will, of an individual. Does that make sense?
Right, absolutely. And I think that it's really important and poignant of you to remark that it's important not to romanticize those pre-capitalist African societies in a certain way, because it's absolutely true that other issues of patriarchy, class divisions did exist in a different form,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps than they
Mm-hmm.
existed in Western Europe, but also to be able to understand the nuances in kind of the way that human life was valued differently, or perhaps the social organization was built upon a different set of values, not necessarily better in all aspects, but
Right.
had definitely something that we can gain today from observing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask something that I found kind of funny about Discourse when I was rereading it last night in preparation for this interview is that Cesaire says that the barbarism of Western Europe has only been surpassed by that of the United States, which I thought was such an interesting comparison to make, because I think that a lot of people would feel perhaps even the opposite, that Western Europe is the father of colonialism, and that the United States, in fact, did not even have any colonies in Africa.
Wow.
Allegedly, they say it's unsure with
Liberia.
yeah, exactly. And the Firestone Company, it's unsure. But in general, the United States did not play as big of a role in colonialism in Africa specifically as Western Europe did. So why do you think that he says that the barbarism of Western Europe has been surpassed by the
I
United States?
mean, I think the United States, has participated in African colonialism because where are all the black people here coming from, girl? Where are all the black people here coming from?
That's fair. However,
No, but you don't need a colony. I think we also have to really, unwed or divorce ourselves from this idea that, yeah, they may not have colonies, but the very substrate of this nation, right? You could call America this place. I mean, black people living in this place, this is an extension of Africa, right? This is an overseas colony, right? For these people. So the US, ironically and paradoxically, becomes an extension of Africa, given the black presence here and the fact that the black presence here allowed for the creation of this landscape. So in many ways, African Americans, Africans in the diaspora are internal what do you call it? Colonized. They are internally colonized, right, within the settler colonial framework. I mean, they live as internally colonized subjects, right, within a colonial apparatus that is settler colonial by extension, right? So that was not my answer, but I just wanted us to think about colonialism and colony differently. But yeah, I mean, I think that what Césaire is saying there is very fundamental. Because what settler colonialism does, I mean, how are the Americans living here
right.
if they have not committed acts of genocide? Like when you look at Raoul Peck's documentary, you need to really check it out. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I think it's called something brute. But look at it's on what do you call it? Max. Now they call it Max, HBO shit, but it's called something Max, okay? Exterminate the brute. It's called Exterminate the Brute. And in one of the, it's a series, it's a 4-piece or 5-piece series. But in one of the episodes, they begin with this very interesting visualization of how the arrival of the Europeans on the American continent slowly caused the extermination of the Indians, and how this arrival re-territorialized this territory belonging to indigenous people into a European territory. And that this act of re-territorialization was based on the cleansing of this landscape for European satisfaction. I mean, really. Because indigenous folks, in spite of the fact that they resisted, I mean, they were seen as a nuisance. They were seen as an eyesore. They were seen as being in the way. Right? And so when Cesaire talks about that, Cesaire is basically giving us the ways in which the genocidal bloodbath undertaken by America to be able to have this country called the USA far surpasses the cultures that have had to disappear.
Right.
The languages, the histories, the philosophies, the political economies, all these, the spiritual activities, those formations that has have to be disappeared because of American presence. Of course, that far surpasses what the Europeans did in Africa.
And it is important to note as well that the United States, I would say perhaps very lightly, the United States did not have colonies in Africa, excluding Liberia. However, the United States definitely did have colonies in other places like the Philippines, Guam. We could
Puerto
consider
Rico,
Hawaii,
U.S. Virgin Islands. Yes, of course.
So the Marshall Islands, there's many we could discuss.
No, but the colonial relationship to Africa, but it's from America, it's really through the presence of Black people here. Black people are here precisely because of this colonial project, right? That was necessitated by European imperialism. And I think that connection, always has to be made.
And as a slight digression, it's interesting that you bring up the extermination of indigenous people in the United States, because I recently, as you know, did a video on Israel and what's going on in Gaza right now. And one of the comments I got was, well, if you support indigenous people in the United States and you support land back, then you should support Israel.
Well, they don't read the history books.
And I had to laugh. I had to laugh.
The history books.
The way that this concept of indigeneity has been weaponized against
to
colonize is I mean, the contradictions are so severe that I don't think anybody who is a serious academic with rigor could even make such a statement, comparing the situation of Native indigenous people in the United States to the Israeli settlers.
But again, these are the cherry-picking politics of the moment, right? And cherry-picking politics often blind us from the facts, whatever they are. But this this is why I started my conversation with what exactly is a human, right? Who is viewed as human, right? In these kinds of conversations, in these kinds of discussions that, there is always someone who is going to be viewed as less human as someone, right? So in many ways, Aisha, I think when people make these kinds of claims, I'm like, well, they do clearly have an impoverished understanding of the histories that have produced the conditions we are talking about.
Right. And it's so interesting that impoverished indeed is a fantastic way to put it. And it's so interesting because, the kinds of intellectual debates that underscore the situation in Gaza right now, and we're digressing, but I think that it's an important.
No, they are very interconnected, my love. No problem.
To make the kinds of political conversations are not being informed by the historical context whatsoever. The conversations that are dominating in the United States about the situation in Israel right now are antithetical to any type of real intellectual debate. And it's clear that we're not even agreeing on what the facts of the situation are. I also had somebody comment, and this was just honestly hilarious. I couldn't even, but they commented and they said, how is it possible that Israel is colonizing the land when Jacob, Abraham, and Isaac were there before any of these people? And I'm like, Abraham isn't even the conversation becomes so unserious.
Oh, I mean, but again, this is what religion also does. Like, it's a distract. So some of the the effects of this is that, like, this religious histories, which are all fictions, right? Like, this is a form of distraction.
Right.
It's distracting us from, it's really taking our attention from really seeing the truth for what it is. And really, this should go, like I said before, capitalism loves this when like capitalism likes these kinds of distractions.
Right. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Capitalism tries to let us blame it on these things and not to focus on capital as being at the root of the problem.
Right.
Right? Because I, as someone who's interested in the ways in which materiality conditions, oppression, like, why aren't we even talking about the ways in which capital is, we are not talking about capitalism in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, but clearly that is the thing we should talk about.
Right. Yeah. No, we're being distracted between,
Mhm.
biblical histories.
Exactly.
It's extremely unfortunate. But to return to Césaire, something that I did want to discuss is that, he and a lot of this he's clapping back at his haters. Like honestly, like in a lot of discourse is him talking about a lot of academics that he doesn't like, historians that he doesn't like, and saying that basically not only are they bourgeois, but they're racist and they hide it. So he brings up some people of his time of the 1950s, Ernest Renan, Yves Florent, different people, and he talks about um, how this kind of critique, they basically promulgate this ideology of racial and cultural hierarchy,
Mhm.
but low key though. Like they're not outwardly like super racist, but they use different ideas, geographical determinism, all of these
Which is
different
all
things.
racist, which is all racist.
Right, right. They're subtle.
Let's call them for their
Right.
really.
And I kind of wanted to, shake the table a little bit and ask you, if you could identify perhaps some academic, some historians, some political figures that you feel like, do you feel like this phenomenon of kind of working as the colonial underdog in a cultural sphere, whether it's academia, history, do you feel like this is alive and well today? And if so, could you identify some figures that you feel like promulgate it?
Like promulgate this contradictions.
Yeah, like the colonial, for example, he gives this example of this guy who is saying that basically civilizations have only been created in areas of the world that were cold. And he's saying that basically the implication is that, well, obviously the Africans never contributed anything to civilization in history, and whatever they did contribute, it was because those people were not African, i.e., the Egyptians. And so I'm wondering, especially as an academic yourself, on our home campus of Georgetown University, where I am an alum, do you feel like these kinds of colonial subtleties in the cultural sphere in academia are alive and well in some of the arguments that your colleagues present, in some of the arguments that you are seeing play out in academia in the United States at large?
So, not that I'm going to be mentioning names, but like I'm going to be calling out a very interesting culprit, silence, right? Sometimes, arguments don't have to be made, because silence could be a form of argument. Right. And I am quite astounded by the sheer nature of the silence, among several of my colleagues, especially those who are, not people of color. Right. That there is really this kind of silence, in faculty meetings at the SFS around, okay, how do we broach this topic? And for me, I mean, I'm hoping that if Césaire were to be with us today, Césaire would really be very critical of the ways in which silence becomes a very um, active weapon,
Mm-hmm.
right? In how we broach these issues, in how like we avoid these issues, like because I think that, you know, the statements that have been made are silent statements. And for me, those silent statements or silence become a statement that says a lot to me about the politics of some of our colleagues.
And honestly, I'll just add that, as at my time at Georgetown as a student, I think that the kinds of arguments are constantly evolving that call back to coloniality and in some cases just like blatant racism. And I'll say that in one of the courses that I took, there was a conversation going around about climate and climate change and the ways in which that impacts different groups. And the professor, who had previously worked in the Obama administration and was a Harvard graduate,
Mhm.
essentially was saying that it doesn't make sense to say that climate change impacts people based upon class differently, because regardless of whether or not somebody's beach house or somebody's house is swept up in a hurricane, they still lost a house. And there are certainly racial implications, and the class aspect is clear, but there are racial implications to the idea that climate change is something that affects everybody the same
No.
equally. And y'all should stop complaining
Mhm.
specifically whether it's impoverished nations, island nations who contributed the least to climate change but are that are subjugated to the worst of the effects, or whether it's literally poor and colored people in
Mhm.
places like the United States or Western Europe who don't have the means to be able to deal with climate change in any type of way, and they're the ones who are hit first when it comes to natural disasters. So this kind of flattening of the experience
Mhm.
obfuscates the very real racial and class um, kind of aspects of climate change. And I think that if Cesaire was there, if he had heard this kind of discourse, it's like it's always evolving to make it seem like that's not what actually is happening. Like you're confused for viewing it in a way that is racial or that is, no, we're objective. It's we're looking at things from a neutral standpoint. And the neutral thing to say is that, well, climate change affects everybody equally.
Because that's the liberal mantra,
Right.
right? Liberalism is, I call liberalism, I think when I had this conversation with you sometime this week, Aisha, I feel liberalism is the purest form of conservatism, right? Liberalism is really conservatism with a very appealing, aesthetically pleasing face, right? And that I this idea of neutrality, I've been really thinking about, because I do work on climate change and environment and the ways in which Africa is like Africans are saying that, okay, African governments are saying that, well, you know, you guys exploited us and became modern and blah, blah, blah. Now we want to do it to you. Are saying that, oh, we shouldn't do it because of climate change, blah, 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 you know, and you are like trying to police how we do that. So there's a kind of climate colonialism that is, or environmental colonialism, that this history of the exploitation of African environment has produced in the contemporary moment, where Africans are being dictated to on how to use their resources, right? I mean, forgetting the fact that the history of environmental exploitation in Africa is a history of colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, right? And so that now Africans are now having to, they are faced with this climate conundrum, of course,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then they're also faced with this environmental colonial conundrum
Mm-hmm.
that's coming from the West, in terms of how the West is trying to dictate to Africans on how to preserve the environment, when clearly they still continue to extract from us, you know?
Right.
I
And
mean,
yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that specifically. I recently was reading articles about the climate conference, COP 28, and they were talking about the coloniality, and they were talking about how, some African countries felt like it was unfair for Western countries to say, oh, well, you can't use this, you can't use that to develop. And they're like, well, you used it to develop. And now you want to tell us we can't use it to develop. It's interesting. It's definitely an interesting contradiction, because on one hand, absolutely, it is very hypocritical, and Western countries did this to China as well, that when China uses the exact same methods of development
Tactic.
they use, now all of a sudden it's, you guys are doing the worst kind of
Of
pollution.
polluting the environment, you
Yeah.
know.
But on the other hand, we also do still only have one Earth. So if everybody jumps on the Western model of development, is going to be a little tense. But I just wanted to
Yeah,
ask.
but that is really, yeah, that's really it. And again, that is why I'm like, it is like we are in a world where we are all becoming like the barbarian.
Hmm. Hmm. And I
And
wanted,
that is where we are.
yeah, in terms of methods of development, actually, this is a great segue into my next question. You know, Cesaire mentions he's not looking behind in the history. He's not looking back. He doesn't want to return to a pre-capitalist, and also it's not possible to return to
No,
a pre-capitalist
it's
world, but he's
impossible.
looking to the future. And the example that he gives of what kind of country is looking to the future and what kind of new society that we have is the Soviet Union. And I wanted to ask you if you could kind of contextualize, why is it that so many of these radical African thinkers during the 1950s and 60s were looking to the Soviet Union as a model for development in a different way, in a more equal way,
Right.
especially knowing what we perceive the Soviet Union to be today?
Now, yeah, I think we need to understand the political climate of the time, right? And the fraudulence that a lot of these writers, C.L.R. James, Aimé Césaire, Claudia Jones, not Marcus Garvey, what's his name? Malcolm Ness, who became later George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, that there really is a kind of, Paul Robeson, Eslanda Robeson, his wife, like all these figures who were critical of American empire, Western empire, somehow found some refuge in the citadel afforded, or the citadel, I will call it a citadel called the Soviet Union. This is not to say that the Soviet Union at the time did not have its own limitations, but I think it accorded to these Black folk, right, something that they were not accorded. One, their humanity, their intellectual intent, there was a support and the critical mass, right? And they needed that. And of course, they saw a certain fear in the US of the Soviet Union, right? And so I think they were also, as being humans, if my nation oppresses me, if someone oppresses you, you are going to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So that kind of logic, right, might have actually somehow steered them towards the Soviet Union, right? So think about the Communist International as being a space where a lot of these Black thinkers, found or sowed their seeds of intelligence and whatnot, right? That they derived nourishment intellectually from these spaces. They derived nourishment politically from these spaces. They derived nourishment spiritually from these spaces, that they felt like humans.
Right.
Right. And this is not to say that the Soviets did not have their own racist tendencies, because, of course, the likes of C.L.R. James had to, at some point, leave the communist intern. Claudia Jones did too, right? But like the kinds of troubles they had with Soviet Union
Hmm.
were not comparable to the dehumanizing problems, the problems that led them into exile. Claudia Jones was exiled. Claudia Jones was incarcerated, right? That they did not have that kind of pressure in the Soviet Union. So it makes sense that Césaire would look to the Soviet Union in this particular historical moment, because this was the gravitation. That then was a trajectory that all these Black thinkers and non non-white thinkers were going. And then again, this then becomes or sets the precedent, right? That, at some point, there was a discontentment with the Soviet Union too. And so then they were like, we have to become they have to form the non-aligned movement, right? So the Bandung conference, the Bandung conference then becomes this kind of, a space, it climaxes, right? The breaking down of the allegiance, right, both for America and the Soviet Union, because they eventually realized, especially during the Cold War period, that oh, these two big monolithic entities do not have our interests at heart, right? So then the non-aligned movement, which as we are talking, there's a non-aligned movement conference happening right now in Kampala, right? Exactly. See, people don't know about it, right? But there's a big non-aligned movements happening right now in Kampala. You may want to check it out, which really speaks to the continuing, disenchantment, if you will, with both the Soviet Union and now Russia and the Western world, right? And the UN Secretary General was there actually.
Antonio Guterres?
He gave a speech yesterday.
Okay, I did not know that, and I
Your
should.
boss.
Yeah, exactly. Let me say, I think a lot of people would be surprised, people who perhaps are not as familiar with the Black radical tradition or only one particular strain of it, that there is this really strong connection between Black radicalism and communism and socialism, even to the point where I think that Mao invited Du Bois to China for his
Yeah.
birthday, his
Yes.
97th birthday.
Du Bois got an honorary doctorate, was given
Right.
this kind of Star of China. So when you go to Du Bois's house in Ghana, the robe from Mao that was given to him is there. The
Okay.
students are going to go there when we go in
Yeah.
March.
That's amazing. And
I
that,
know.
that tradition is quite deep. And there are definitely, like you pointed out, some there's friction. There's friction. It's not like, oh, only because the United States was treating their colored people in general so badly that they turned to the Soviet Union. There's some serious, very serious engagement with the likes of Claudia Jones and Du Bois with communist and socialist thought, and the tradition is steep. But let me just ask, you in particular, because I don't think I've ever asked you this, but in terms of political orientation, as someone who is African, as someone who is Black, as someone who is a part of the LGBT community, a part of it's many different intersections of identity, how do you identify politically? We talk about how on the left there is so much kind of segmentation, like even between the communists, they're fighting, you're the Maoist, you're the Stalinist, you're the, et cetera, et cetera. But I kind of just wanted to ask, what do you, or do you refuse to put yourself in a box?
I refuse to do that. You've asked me this question. You've been always trying to put
I
me in
did.
a box. Yeah. No, you have been always trying
Yeah.
to figure me out, and
Yeah.
I'm slippery.
Mhm.
So I think the only box I'm in is a slippery box. So I don't know.
Yeah, because you're following a lot of schools of thought. There's
Mhm.
at least in the course that I took with you, there's
Mhm.
Marxist thought, there's surrealist thought,
Mhm.
there's an African feminist
Feminist, yes,
tradition,
yes, yes, yes. Black
environmentalist,
radical tradition.
Black radical
So
tradition.
again, like I am really, I am an ananse, I am a weaver. If you am a spider, I have to weave. I don't, do
Right.
that shit.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think that is the best way to be. That's why the spider is so successful,
Mm,
right? Because they don't, bottle themselves up, they
yeah.
weave. And
Right.
that's why they catch insects and those things that define themselves.
Right. No, it's a good point, and I think that sometimes the definition is limiting.
Limiting.
I think that a lot of people on the left realize, like, at some point it's like, listen, like, our coalition is becoming a bit weak because of the insisting on limitations and definitions. So let me just ask also, returning to Cesaire and kind of, because he's clearly influenced by Marxist thought, but he also kind of has beef with Marx, to say it plainly, because of Marx's, as you mentioned, omission of a kind of serious analysis. He mentions it. He's like the slavery that he mentions it, but it's not as serious of an analysis as he has in England and the English working class. And Césaire, in a kind of Marxist strain, he writes that the nation as an idea is a bourgeois phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what is the connection between nation states and bourgeois ideology? To me, this sentence kind of threw me for a loop because I'm like, does he mean when he says the nation is a bourgeois phenomenon? Does he
Well,
mean
go
yes?
on.
Does he mean that the nation state came into being during a time that was proto-capitalist and then pushing into a capitalist time?
Absolutely.
Treaty of Westphalia.
Absolutely. Yes. The treaty, yes. I mean, he doesn't even have to say anything more. I mean, the Treaty of Westphalia, right, really sets the tone, right? Because we need to understand, okay, why was the Treaty of Westphalia? Why did the European nations meet in Germany or then the Austro-German Empire, right, to embark on or to sign this treaty? What was going on in Europe at the time? And if so, does it coincide with the origin of capital, of industrial, we need, and of colonialism, right? Like there is something that is going on. And so in this new project that I'm trying to do, I'm trying to really think about the ways in which the Treaty of Westphalia, which anticipates the Berlin Conference, right, which is then which becomes the oven, if you will, in which African nation states were formed. Right, because at the Berlin Conference, the Europeans, without the Africans, just decided to carve Africa out for themselves, right? That like in what ways, right, are these histories anticipatory of what Cesaire is saying when he in fact says, right, the nation is a bourgeois formation because all these the treaties were convened by bourgeois people. The Treaty of Westphalia, which led to the demarcations of Europe, right, is uh, uh, is is really Berlin Conference for Africa, right? So if the Treaty of Westphalia is to Europe, then but Berlin, in terms of the formation of nation states in Europe, the Berlin Conference is to Africa in terms of nation state formation. And all these, uh, conferences, if you will, all these events were orchestrated by bourgeois people,
Yeah.
right? Bourgeois people who had investments, right, in these spaces and were seeking to make profits, who actually anticipated profits from the demarcations that were established under the Westphalian Treaty and the Berlin Conference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that reminds me of, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter
Exactly.
Rodney, how he uses I love the specific examples of some companies and corporations that are still around today, like Barclays Bank.
Barclays Bank, JP Morgan, Aetna,
Yeah. Does
Standard
he mention
Chartered,
Unilever? I feel like he does.
Unilever is one.
Yeah. And the soap that they
Yes,
make.
yes, 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 yes.
Yes, but it's so interesting to see because it shows so clearly how our world is nothing but, a result of precedent. It's
Mm-hmm.
like these things keep building on each other.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
gonna go away. And
It's cascading like that.
I don't I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'll just have my final question, in which I really wanted us to discuss and get into the meat of. You kind of actually, prophesized my question in the beginning, but the final question was, how can we apply the message of discourse on colonialism to understand what's going on in the world today in places like Palestine, the Congo, and Sudan?
I I don't know what apply means. I don't know the sense in which whether when you say apply, I'm thinking of okay, is it the verb or is it just a description?
Mhm.
Like
As in, like, for example, I guess what we were talking about, what's going on in Palestine, and I think that we could apply Césaire's discourse in the way that he talks about colonization equaling thingification, and the dehumanization of the Palestinians, and the ways in which he talks about the colonizer being dehumanized by colonizing.
Yes, of course. I mean, and that is really what you and I have always wrestled with, is that like bourgeois values, if you will, uh, and my students are reading this for Africa as People from African Images, Peter Rigby's piece. And while I was reading the piece yesterday, Rigby is really making this phenomenal comment or statement about how bourgeois values are like practical inert, like bourgeois values are inherently violent, right? And so bourgeoisness itself, so I don't know why my hand raised itself. So bourgeoisness, if you will, has somehow defined, right, what violence is, right? And what bourgeois ideology defines as violence, right? Because of course the state of reason is bourgeois, right? The dominant state of reason is bourgeois. Now let's go back to Antonio Gramsci when Gramsci talks about hegemony, right? So then, you know, the hegemonic state of reason is bourgeois. That hegemonic state of reason would never regard or define bourgeois violence as violence.
Absolutely.
Right? And so Césaire is basically trying to say that, you know, the fact that bourgeois violence is not even named is representative or reflects the violence of the bourgeois. It's a violence, it does violence to the bourgeois. Right, because the bourgeois does not, like the Americans don't see themselves as violent when they are killing people abroad, like the Israelis don't see themselves as violent when they are killing people in Palestine. No, it is because the ideological state is such that like there's a certain violence in the bourgeois failure to name being bourgeois as itself a violent place to be.
Absolutely.
And that for me is the ultimate form of violence, the unnaming of the violence of the perpetrator.
And I think that's so poignant. And I have to be careful with my analysis here because I don't want to, you know, they have shooters everywhere. So I don't want to get myself on some list. However, what you're saying about the naming of violence is something I have been thinking about so much because it's interesting to me that the state defines concepts for us, defines criminality, defines violence. And so the United States going to Iraq and killing 3 million people is self-defense. And it is justified. And because it's being done by a state, there isn't the same level of outrage at that there is when 2,000 Israelis are killed by the group Hamas. And if we were to remove the language that we're using to identify one group as a terrorist and the other group as a state that has legitimacy, it would become immediately clear that they are enacting disproportionate levels of violence onto whatever group in question. And so it's like, why would it be, for example, that the Israelis were able to use, prior to the establishment of the state of Israel, were able to use violence to achieve their means, which was the creation of the state. There was Zionist terrorism, there were Zionist bombings, right? Now, in retrospect, it's justified because they achieved the purpose of the state of Israel. And so it can be viewed as, well, it's not violent if it was right? Allegedly. And so now in the world that we live in, it's like, the person that gets to determine, and Walter Rodney says that, he says it's an African proverb. I've never heard it, but it's still poignant. He says that until the lion learns how to speak, the tail will always like glorify the hunter. And that is just so poignant because it's like, why is it that no matter how much violence that a state can do, like the United States, for example, the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons on another country, is not viewed as a violent terrorist organization. Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS have
Mau
never
Mau.
have
This is
not
what I'm
contributed
saying.
to the same
Yeah.
amount of violence. And that's not to say that they're justified. It's just to say that even in sheer numbers, they are not contributing to the same amount of violence that countries like the United States are.
But then again, this is even beyond the realm of that. Like, I mean, I do this work on, yeah, this might be because I have to be somewhere by 12:30.
Yeah.
Like, Aisha, in Ghana right now, there is this whole ruckus around artisanal miners. They are called galamsey. And how these galamsey miners, mind you, are destroying our water bodies, So there are all these like people are hurling and raining, epithets and being critical of them and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, these are poor indigenous people who have been dispossessed by these large, huge mining concessions, right? These mining concessions come in with their very ginormous technological infrastructure and then crater holes in the earth. They leave massive pits. They dig, they dynamite, they explode, they destroy nature. But now we are actually calling the poor, the indigenous people whose contributions to environmental whatever is minuscule compared to what these concessions do. And we are saying that they are destroying our environment. Right? And I'm like, that's the same kind of reading that, like, of course, right? That whoever gets to define the defined, right, determines the fate of the defined.
If you're not careful, the media will have you, loving the oppressor and hating the oppressed. Listen, we're
And
being
and
collectively
the
gaslit.
academy too, and the academy too.
We're being gaslit by the state. We're being
No,
gaslit
no,
by
the
the
nation state is actually the ultimate expression of gaslighting.
and we see, you heard it here, folks. You heard it first here. That's the truth. And
The nation state is really the ultimate embodiment, the ultimate gaslighter.
yeah, they rewrite history and then they're like, you didn't know.
Yes, they would really, the nation state is the ultimate embodiment. Yes.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really illuminating, and I
I
love
hope,
talking about this.
of course, I hope this was helpful,
Yeah,
really.
absolutely. I think that a lot of people will be able to find value in it. And,
I
I
hope
don't want you
so.
to miss your meeting. But one
No,
more thing, if you have anything
of
to
course.
advertise, is there a book that's coming out? Is there, where can we find you? Where will we see you next?
Okay, good question. So I'm currently at work on my second book. It's called The Salvage Slot: Technology and the Ecologies of the Afterlife. I am really interested in the ways in which obsolete technology gets dumped into Ghana, and how I'm interested in the idea of the afterlife in the sense that, like, I think, so when I say ecology of the afterlife, what I mean is that I think waste is already the afterlife of something, right? And so the place where waste goes to rest is the afterlife of waste. Right. So the afterlife is basically a play on that, right? So I'm interested in the ways in which Africa becomes an afterlife, right? Where all the things that are seen as obsolete and unnecessary and not needed in the West, and within Africa gets dumped, and trying to historicize why Africa has become a place for extraction and deposition. And I'm drawing, of course, a lot on the works of Walter Rodney to think about this project. So I'm hoping to finish this by the end of the year. I'm also making a film to accompany this documentary to this book. So I'm going during my visit in Ghana, I'll be there with the filmmaker for an extra week to, collect the necessary required information that would make this documentary a hit, I would hope.
And we'd love to link it to that. If you
Of
have, do you have a
course.
website? Do you have
No,
a
not yet. I'm not as fancy as some of y'all, so I do
Squarespace?
not
No.
yet. Yeah, so unless, of course, you want to offer me your services by creating a website for the film, I don't
Listen, I'd love to participate.
know. No, seriously. I mean, if that's the case, we can actually work something out. But yeah, thank you so much
Of
for
course, yeah.
giving me this
We'll put
platform.
that we'll put that in the bio so that
Mhm.
people can know, where to
Please,
find you and
please,
where your
please.
next
That'll
project
be
will come
nice.
from.
That'll
So
be nice. That'll be nice.
thank you
This
so
has
much
been
for your
such a
time.
pleasure and joy. We should
It's
do this
always a pleasure.
again.
Yes, it's
You
always
can
really.
always have me on again if you
Yeah.
like.
Yes, absolutely. We got more texts we're going through. We got, I want to do race in class.
Oh yes, let's do that. Let's do that. Angela
But
Davis. Is it
I'll let
Angela
you go.
Davis?
No, sorry. I meant wait. No, I meant capitalism and slavery.
Okay,
And then
okay.
I meant women, race, and class. Yes.
Okay, Eric Williams would be great. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do it. Let's do it.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much for your time,
Welcome, love. Take
Professor.
care. Have a
All
lovely
right. Have a
Sunday.
great
Bye.
day.
You too.
Goodbye.
Bye.